welcome and thank you so much, people all over the world who are watching, and then people right here. Thank you for attending. I am so excited about this session because it's really, for want of a better word, cool. Okay, I guess I'm dating myself, but you have to date somebody, I guess. I'm just going to start off with some quick introductions, and then we're going to jump right into the subject of today. So, Dina Katabi is right next to me. She's professor of electrical engineering and computer science at MIT, where she directs the Center for Wireless Networks and Mobile Computing. I will confess that I was afraid of mispronouncing, but maybe they want that name. So how would you pronounce that?
The Swan and Nicole Pham Professor.
Yeah, okay. It's Thuan. Thuan?
Yeah.
Okay, Thuan and Nicole Pham, professor of electrical engineering, where she directs the Center for Wireless Networks and Mobile Computing. Her research focuses on innovations in mobile computing, wireless sensing, and machine learning with application to digital health. And I have to embarrass the heck out of her by saying, yes, she did win a MacArthur Genius Award. So we are looking forward to, some real genius in a few minutes. It's a lot of pressure, isn't it, when you win one of those awards and then people say, so say something genius.
It is.
Say something genius. Okay. Michael Snyder is to her left. He's the chair of genetics and director of the Center of Genomics and Personalized Medicine at Stanford University School of Medicine. Great organization, a great place. Snyder is a leader in the field of functional genomics and multiomics. Multiomics?
Yep.
Multiomics. And he will define all those words. And one of the major participants of the ENCODE project. Snyder, he launched the field of personalized medicine, and his laboratory pioneered the use of wearables technology like smartwatches and continuous glucose monitoring for precision health. He has an amazing background. Just quick show of hands, how many people here are wearing some sort of device that is monitoring something that's in your body? And it's the majority of people here. Isn't that interesting? And Stephen Friend is the president and co-founder of For You and Me, it's the number 4, studied genetic resilience and cancer biology before his current work on digital health and the return of human agency. Current projects anticipate individuals following their clinical symptoms at times of metamorphosis. Wow, times of metamorphosis. I love that. Using wearable devices uncoupled from companies that may use that information for commercial benefit, and that is going to be part of our discussion later. All right, so I put down my iPhone, I take off my glasses, we roll up our sleeves, and we have some fun. So they're going to give a little spiel about themselves, and then I'm going to start off with Dina, and away we go.
So, hi everyone, I'm Dina Katabi. I'm very happy to be here. So about myself, I work, as John said, in the area of machine learning and sensors for healthcare, for digital health. And I'm sure you heard a lot about wearables, and you're going to hear more during this session. But one of the things that excites me a lot is, can we collect everything that the wearables collect for us, and perhaps many more things, but without any wearables, without asking you to wear any sensors that can get your breathing, your heartbeat, your mobility, your sleep. When actually during sleep you are in the stage during which you dream, like REM, versus the other stages. All of that without asking you to wear any sensors, by just analyzing how your body changes the electromagnetic waves around you using novel machine learning. And that's really what excites me and what I work on almost all the time. And now we have our devices with patients everywhere.
Michael.
I'm Michael, actually.
Michael.
Just we probably switched on you just to confuse you.
Stephen, sorry, Stephen.
Okay.
I'm going to try to interpret genomics and wearable devices, and I can't keep the name straight. So, there's a little bit of a disconnect there, but we did just meet. Okay, sorry.
Not at all.
Stephen.
Stephen Friend, I had a number of years where I was interested in oncology, in genetics, and as we got into the last 10, 20 years, it became clear that the concept of what people had in terms of their genetics were being matched up against symptoms of what people said they had, of phenotypes, we call it, and began to think that actually the genomic measurements might be getting more accurate than the phenotypic measures.
And defines phenotypic, just...
Yeah, so phenotypic is when someone says, I have Alzheimer's disease, or I have multiple sclerosis. Before, we'd all try to figure out what is in that patient. Imagine if those disease categories, would be a way of thinking of it, or symptoms, were wobbly. And when someone said, I have this disease, or that, say Crohn's disease, that maybe our ability to assess that could be improved by following what was happening to someone, tracking, talking to them, et cetera. So the work that we've been doing on wearables has been asking, can you take those physiologic signals and sensor signals and turn them into symptoms, turn them into what a clinician could work with? And the only other little short part is there's a real advantage if you could have many life interventions so that that data that was coming off of individual was actually going back to them for what they wanted to do and not being sucked up someplace for someone who wanted to do something with it. And so great to have the dialogue with a clinician, but maybe there are ways to have some concepts of intervention without necessarily going to a clinician every time you have a question.
Okay, I'm Mike Snyder. Our shtick is to use big data to try and transform healthcare. I think the healthcare system we have now is broken in a lot of different ways. It's really focused on sick care, i.e. treating you when you're ill, not trying to keep you healthy. It makes decisions about you based on population-based measurements, meaning if your normal baseline temperature, say, is 94 degrees and you get measured at 98.6, which they think is the normal, they'll tell you you're healthy, everything's fine, but you're really sick if you're up 4 degrees over your baseline. So we think it's important for everyone to get their healthy baselines, look for shifts up, and we use genome sequencing to make risk predictions. We do deep molecular omics profiles, as they're called, to measure as many molecules out of your blood and urine, even your poop. You've heard a little about this at the meeting already. And lately, we've been doing a ton with wearables. We can actually tell in 80% of the cases when you're getting COVID before at symptoms simply from your smartwatch. So we want to see these technologies that are in the research phase now. We do spin off a lot of companies to try and scale them, but we want to see them move in mainstream healthcare.
Great, that's a great introduction. And then before we start the big discussion here, I've got to I want to, as a clinician, sort of set the stage for this. So I'm a professor of medicine at NYU Langone Health. I'm an internist and a gastroenterologist. I also actually am a computer nerd. I did the first fellowship in medical computing in the 80s with Paul Clayton and wrote software that runs doctor's offices, and that was a whole other life. But the reason why I tell you that is that I am just bursting with anticipation of where this is going to lead. This is an enormously important development and field. And the reason is, when I see somebody for internal medicine, I'm seeing them probably once a year, and I actually spend a lot of time with them. I go over from head to toe, but it's once a year. I'm relying on their memory, which may or may not be accurate. I'm relying on them to pick up signals in their life that they may just go by their head because they just don't notice it. Even if they remember some symptom that they had, they may not understand that it was a symptom. And then the idea of trying to take all that data, right? It's all about data, and somehow compile it, analyze it. We'll get into machine learning and AI, artificial intelligence, in ways that we may not even understand what the computer's doing, but can actually predict certain things about the person. And I'll give you a little example, and then we're going to start this, is that at the Mayo Clinic, they did a study showing with an electrocardiogram, with machine learning, you can tell what somebody's potassium is. What? You can tell their sex with pretty good accuracy. And I said to Dr. Friedman, who told me about this, how does it do that? He goes, we don't know. But which is something that is disturbing to a clinician who has to rely on, if it's really important data that we're going to make a decision about, like, what do you mean you don't know? How do I trust it? So these are the issues that I want to talk about. I want to start off with Dina. She gave, please go look up her TED Talk, which is just, it is great. She did a wonderful job, and there are some graphics and illustrations that we can't show here that really make it much easier to understand. But start off talking about the Force.
The Force. Yeah, so I'm a Star Wars fan, of course, like many of you, I would assume. But to me, it's also, as a technologist, one of the things that is really amazing is, can we have something like the Force? Can we have, like, if you think about the Force for people who are Star Wars fans, it's just like, as a Jedi, you are able to sense people and far away from you, that you don't see them, by just the Force. And that, of course, for any kid is an amazing thing to have. But if you think about something like electromagnetic waves, they're kind of similar. So they travel through space, they traverse walls and occlusions, and let's think that there is somebody in this building. I mean, wireless signal will go through that wall and will bounce off their body and will come back. And it turned out that actually, if you analyze these wireless signals with the right machine learning, with the right algorithm and technologies, you can actually tell what they are doing. You can tell when they are asleep, when they are awake. If they are asleep, you can tell whether they are in REM sleep versus light sleep versus deep sleep. You can get their respiration. You get the pulsing of their blood from the electromagnetic signals without even touching them, without even seeing them. And that, to me, I mean, of course, connection to the Force is very interesting, but the connection to the healthcare system, because one of the biggest things in measuring people is measuring them without changing what you are measuring. Because when you ask somebody to do some measurement, enter some PRO, or enter some diaries, or put something on their body to measure themselves, you might change the condition under which you are measuring. And being able to measure people as they live continuously is something amazing that would let us know much, much more about their diseases, their health, how the diseases and the impact of response to drugs manifest themselves on this living individual.
And to give a very discrete example, white coat hypertension, right? I'm an internist, the person hops up on the table, and the blood pressure is 150 over 100. And I go, okay, you're on a beach, close your eyes, you're relaxing. Suddenly, tidal wave! No, I try to keep them, try to keep them very relaxed. And then their blood pressure comes down to 120 over 80, right? So the Force is strong in this one. It is very strong. The other thing, just to give, because I had this question when we fortunately were able to have a Zoom call recently, and I didn't see it right away, which is there is an actually physical box in the room that is placed that is emitting waves that then bounce off, that don't hurt the person, but bounce off of them. And that's the way that they can tell if the person's moving or breathing. And it's amazing in the TED Talk. You see not only their breathing, but when they hold their breath, you can see their pulse, little notches when they're holding their breath. It's so cool. So.
How do I go from there?
Sorry, I should set you up for it. No, we had
can go lots of places. We can go into Star Wars.
Sorry.
Say something important, would you, Stephen?
No, in the TED Talk, of course, the issue of privacy did come up, and of course, Dina goes, yes, the dark side of the Force, and we will talk about that. But Michael, because we had sort of talked about this beforehand, what I want.
Where should you go? I'm the Michael. He's the Stephen. I have a feeling we should switch chairs.
You're in reverse alphabetical.
Would that make it easier? We can switch.
No, stay like that. But what are those things where they see the how the audience is they get things, and gauge of John's memory and ability is going like that. But okay, because it's in reverse alphabetical order, which now I'll never forget. Stephen. I just need a mnemonic. Give people an example of the different types of wearables, and of measuring devices. So we have the stuff that you're not wearing. Talk about some of the devices that are out there that you do wear. I was wondering, will there be clothes in the future that people put on a shirt? That's like the shirt stops sunbeams from coming in, in Australia. Are there, what are people working on? So give kind of the big picture of that.
Yeah. The frame wearable should be pretty wide umbrella. The time that people started recognizing the benefit of having what I call semi-continuous measurements, ability to follow someone often, is when smartphones were there. And I point that out because that's the most ubiquitous, and you don't really wear it, and men wear it more than women. And yet, there's a lot of data that comes that's really valuable from the microphone, from the camera, from the touchscreen. So I want to go to something that's sort of at that edge of that umbrella, of that wearable, and say that there's an extraordinary ability to have that, including the virtual interaction that that person has in their physical activity. But if you step off into what you're referring to, I think the watch stands out now in its many varieties as something that someone is normally wearing. So the idea is not having to buy, but something that one would normally consider having. And sitting next to it are devices such as this smart ring that, again, is something that is, as a wearable should be, something that you don't feel I had to put this particular device on, through to the types of devices where you attach it. Mike mentioned the continuous glucose monitors, where you put something on. That's part of that wearable space. But also in that zone, which is sort of halfway between the devices where you're tracking someone and following them from a wireless standpoint, the way Dina is doing. Now there are things called smart scales, where when you step on, you aren't wearing a sock or something like that. It's able to pick up connectivity, conductivity, electrical impulses. And in the studies we do, we can get ejection fraction, we can get pulse waves that are from the heart, we can get fluid content, where is edema. There are a number of things. So there are companies that are working on like this spectrum from the phone, tung, 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 through the ring to patches, to that go all the way through to what I'd say is those invisible things that are being able to track you.
So again, Stephen, he said reverse chronologically, reverse alphabetically. And actually probably not reverse chronologically, but anyway, so, I don't know for sure. I don't have a device. I want you to tell people briefly your background, because it's fascinating and it really does set you up for why you're an expert in this. If you could just talk about where you're coming from, why you know so much about this.
I had done work in trying to understand risks from genes in oncology, and in looking at how you could identify, particularly in cancer, by looking at the properties of a tumor, not saying it's breast or ovarian or whatever, but actually its molecular characteristics. The more dimensions of data you could build about something, the better the care could be. And it's in that context that the recognition that we don't have enough dimensions of information, whether it's about oncology or about Alzheimer's or about others, became sort of obvious that 363 days that you weren't seeing the patient had much more information. And the other point I want to make is that I think we have assumed that someone's disease is a linear process, that it isn't branched, that it is going in some way where the therapies that are given would logically go along one path. And so the other aspect of it is wearables allow not only the inter-individual differences, but the intra-individual differences. And the more you look at patients and what's going on, you realize how absurd it is that these snapshots are being the drivers for care for as long as they are.
You're looking for a movie and you're getting a snapshot, and you don't even have enough to do that little flip thing where you can see some changes. And I want to do the same thing for Michael, which is talk about like where you're coming from, because I think it's very important in terms of even the validity and us buying into like why should we listen to you, about where you came from. This is not somebody who you're fooling around in a lab and let's do some technology and then find something to use it on. It came the other way around. And I think that that's how good things do come around, especially with technology. So talk a little bit about where you came from and then some of the clinical applications.
So as I mentioned, we were all about big data and health, sequencing genomes, doing these deep molecular measurements, which were static basically every 3 months or so. And then when smartwatches came out, basically they're being used as fitness trackers, and people would figure out their activities and their basic heart rates and then throw them in a drawer after 3 months. And we thought, well, these are pretty powerful physiological monitors for all the reasons everybody said here. They measure you 24/7, 365 days a year, as long as you keep them charged. And that turns out to be very, very powerful. So you may not know it, but 50 million people in the US are wearing a smart watch right now. So 20% of the population. And if you think about that, that's a health monitoring device for a large fraction of people. The 3.8 billion people, by the way, to your point, have a smartphone. So more than half the world population have a smartphone. If you compare that with a smartwatch, you could have a health measuring device. But back to my story. So we threw these on our group that we were deeply following with all these measurements. And one of the first things we discovered, of all things, was my Lyme disease. Came out of nowhere before I had symptoms. I noticed that my heart rate was up from the smartwatch, and my blood oxygen dropped from a simple pulse ox. And some of those are now on smartwatch. They weren't at the time. And I knew something was up. 2 weeks earlier, I'd been in rural Massachusetts helping my brother put up fences where 55% of ticks are Lyme infested. And so I had a feeling it could be Lyme. I knew it was abnormal measurements. I did get a fever off and on after that. And I did go to a physician who then drew blood, saw my immune cells were up, said, yep, you've got a bacterial infection. You should take penicillin. And I said, no, I should take doxycycline. Got a little tense for a few moments, as you might imagine. Most physicians don't like their patients telling them what they should do. He did give in, and then I tested when I was back, and sure enough, I was positive. Very well-controlled experiment. I give him blood. You can see I measure myself a lot with these devices and other things. And sure enough, I was negative before I left. I was on this trip to Norway, and I was positive when I got back measured. So, and it was my smartwatch that tipped us off. We could then see from all the data I had, every single time I was ill, my heart rate jumped up and my skin temperature also elevated. And so we wrote algorithms to do that, and that's what led us into this early COVID detection. It's not 100%, it tells you of a stressor. If I can give you one more example, when I got COVID recently, April 10th, and my antigen test was negative, but my smartwatch was positive. So it's more sensitive, we think, than an antigen test, but it's not specific. I didn't know I had positive. I knew there was a stressing event going on, but I didn't know it was COVID.
It was just something's up, your pulse was up.
Correct, yeah. So I knew it was a stressor.
So very quickly, because I want to go from the individual to the population-based public health applications of this, which are fascinating, which bring up the privacy issues. But can you just explain as an example? It's very easy to understand, I think, for most of us. Okay, you're measuring the pulse, that I get, even the breathing, but ejection fraction. So ejection fraction, for those of you who don't know, the heart pumps, and a certain fraction of the blood leaves during the pumping of the blood, during systole. And that number should be a certain percentage, whether it's 50 or 60%, or maybe slightly higher, something like that. How can a wearable device know what's going on in your left ventricle?
So think of the tools that are in most of these wearables as being driven by accelerometers, by ability to location, by cameras. And in this instance, that is coming from, it's not coming from the watch, it was coming from the smart scale. The same thing that allows you to follow heart rate in a watch. And the scale is that there's a pulse wave. When your heart beats, the blood goes out in a certain way, it comes out, comes down.
I see.
And so what's happening there is if you have a sensitive way to sort of go, this is linked and this is what my ECG is, et cetera, and you use a bunch of algorithms, you can say, I can look at heart rate, I can look at heart rate variability, and in that instance, on the scale, is a body port scale, do you see how it then goes to, if it's only injecting this much, the pulse wave will be like this. If there is vessels that are constricted, you can see that.
So I said there's a range of what normal is, and people debate about exactly what that is. I don't know, what do you use when you're in that sense, in that example, for what normal ejection fraction is? Do you use, actually, what's more important, the reason why I'm getting at it is, have you actually diagnosed somebody's heart failure with it? You know, I'm like, because people want to know, okay, this is interesting stuff, but are you really making a difference? And I know there's studies going on, which we'll talk about, to try to see that. But have you done that? Just, I'm curious, maybe not.
We have not,
Okay.
right? And I will stay out of the studies because it sounds like that will come up later. So
yeah, no, but it's potential, right? Obviously, there's a lot of people who have a heart failure who don't know it. And so diagnosing heart failure early is a big deal.
I can add to that, though. In our study of 109 people, one person had AFib, another had sleep apnea. Both were picked up by these wearable devices.
And of course, atrial fibrillation can increase the risk of stroke, and if you know that beforehand, you can do measures to try to stop that. So, all right, so let's come back along in the same room. We'll start with Dina again. That's the personal, and we've got a sort of like a little idea of some of the personal data you can get. Now, thinking about machine learning, thinking about AI, thinking about your work at MIT, how can you take that data and roll it up into the cloud and make it something that's really, really big? Because I want to know in my practice, if I find, so I'll give you a specific example. They're doing this with melanoma. So in melanoma, there are 3D measurement photography that's being done in various places, and they're taking millions of those images, they're putting it up in the web, and then when somebody comes into my office, I can take a picture of something, I wonder if that's a melanoma, and throw it up there. It hasn't happened quite yet, it's an experiment, to say, okay, in the past, when that is biopsied, this is the odds that it's a melanoma, okay? So that's the kind of thing, just to give you an example, to think about how this data could be used. So is it being rolled up yet, or are you thinking about what are the privacy issues in the dark side of the force?
So let's delay talking a bit about the dark side of the force. That's a whole topic on its own. But yeah, I think it's really the power of data comes from the fact that you can collect a large amount of data. Like we all know that even if you think about a drug clinical trial, or you think about any of the physiological symptoms or anything like that, really what we know is that there is a lot of uncertainty and noise in any measurement. But when you collect so much measurement, you can eliminate that noise, reduce it drastically, because you have a large number of measurements. You can average them. There are many ways to do that. So you can change so many things. You can change things in terms of clinical practice, as you were like hinting at, and you can change things in the sense that we can discover new things about medicine that today we don't even perceive as possible, like the potassium, detecting potassium from the experiment that you mentioned.
Cardiogram, yeah.
Yeah. So just to give you an example, so one of the studies that we have been involved with very early on is Parkinson's. So Parkinson's disease, of course, is the fastest growing neurological disease in the world. And in Parkinson's, people get diagnosed years after the disease has started. But the problem is, so you get diagnosed based on motor symptoms. But these motor symptoms start late. And by the time the motor symptoms have started, actually the brain, the neurons have incurred a lot of damage already. And many of the people who are involved in developing drugs for Parkinson's, they need those drugs to be targeted at patients very early on. But if the disease is detected years after it starts, then you have a major problem. So what if somebody comes and say, look, I mean, today we diagnose Parkinson's from motor symptoms, but we can diagnose Parkinson's from nocturnal breathing. We can look at someone's breathing and say, this person has Parkinson's, this person doesn't have Parkinson's. Not only that, we can say the severity of the Parkinson's that they have.
Is it specific to Parkinson's, or is it just an abnormality?
No, this one is specific to Parkinson's in the sense that, for example, it distinguishes between Parkinson's and Alzheimer's.
What is it? What is it that's happening?
So this is one of the things that you mentioned. So it's neural network, so it's machine learning. So it looks at so many data, data samples. And from that, we have looked at 7,000 individuals. 700 of them have Parkinson's, and the rest don't have Parkinson's. And we can detect it with customized machine learning that look at it. Now you say, okay, so what does it exactly look at? We can't tell you exactly what it looks at, because if it were that simple, clinician would have been able to look at someone's breathing and say, okay, so this one has Parkinson's, this one doesn't. It's much more complex.
But is it sleep, or is it just breathing?
So we look at nocturnal breathing. I actually like to look at signals when the persons are asleep, because it normalizes many of the other factors that happen during this person's life. And but what we know is that it is kind of interpretable. So you can look at, okay, so the machine learning focuses on these instances of nocturnal breathing, and then you can map it back and you discover at that exact time, basically for people who, to say that somebody is normal, is looking at times when you have delta waves, which we know from many studies that people who have Parkinson's have problems with EEG delta waves. It's looking at times when there is onset or transition between different sleep conditions or sleep stages. So it has interpretability, but it cannot explain exactly what it's looking at.
So moving on to Stephen in a second, but as the clinician in me, I want to just quickly explain why that is so enormously cool. Because the motor symptoms that she's talking about with Parkinson's, kind of a flattened affect, it could be some rigidity, some tough time walking, what's called festinating gait, cogwheeling. If you move the arm, it's like feels like and they maybe have some pill rolling, a little bit of a tremor. And that you're saying, that by the time that happens, you may already be down the road. And if you can diagnose that, we don't even know what the drug trials would do, what drug intervention earlier would do. I mean, isn't that fascinating? Because dementia is a problem. Cognitive changes is a problem with Parkinson's. And who knows what would happen? Because this, the problem is dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter. There's a lack of it, and maybe just long-term lack of it is part of the thing that's contributing to the dementia. Maybe at the beginning, if you gave that drug earlier or some medication to increase dopamine, it would make a difference. So that is why, I mean, it may sound like, oh, that's cool technology. It's unbelievably important clinically, and now you take that and think about all the other diseases that we might be able to pull back and diagnose earlier. The changes in the brain that happen with Alzheimer's happen 10, 20, 30 years before the symptoms happen. And I can imagine this might be something that's important.
Yeah, this is
too.
like we are now looking at Alzheimer's.
We're thinking that maybe the reason why these amyloid-reducing drugs don't work is that we're using them too late. It's like giving somebody Lipitor after their 5th heart attack, they're already in failure.
Not just that, but also like when you have a drug, for example, that's trying to target the early patients, like prodromal and stuff like this, you cannot show that actually their cognition has improved because their cognition is not problematic yet.
Right.
So how would you measure anything that you improved for them?
And maybe it's the breathing that would improve.
Yeah, maybe.
As a surrogate marker.
Yeah, breathing, the sleep, like many of these things.
This is so great. Clinical, we're going to move down and just do clinical experiments, things that are going on now, what's going on out there, what are you planning, the pregnancy, following the pregnancy. Can you tell somebody's about to deliver somehow in the week before?
On a pair two together, but mostly go to pregnancy. During the first start of COVID, funded by Gates Foundation, when Mike and many others were looking for using wearables to go, can we diagnose or can we get a sense for screening whether someone has? We who have had an interest in the effects of stress on people's bodies had been thinking we should be able to look at healthcare providers, and wouldn't it be nice if we could develop a way to know when their stress was taking them beyond. The intensive nurse syndrome is one where you forget and you're willing to give and you go beyond and you get eventually PTSD. So we did a study looking at healthcare workers around the country, I think all states, and asking, could we follow their stress? Could we get a sense of stress and recovery? And more importantly, were there signs that we could pick up and ways that people process their stress differently? The short version of that, before I go on to pregnancy, is that these types of machine learning AI methods that were just mentioned can go and look at the connections between various physiologic things that are going on in your body. So we call them about connections that make up the state that you're that you are in. So we could look at the state and when someone was moving in and out of stress, and then we could begin to ask, were there prior history, things that had happened to that person that made them more susceptible? And so there's work that we're doing now to ask, could there be a way to give people a sense of, hey, you're going a little too far, and this you should be watching yourself because of all the things that happen in stress. So that sits over there. One of the main studies we're doing now is there's only a small amount of work that is actually done in understanding the process of pregnancy. You might think that it was extremely well studied, but it's not. And when it is, it's almost always by aggregate data, where someone can say, out of this population of 1,000 people, this is what happens to their heart rate, or this happens to their weight, or this happens to that. What we wanted to do was see whether we could get to individual trajectories, N of 1 measures, and ask if you took, and this is a study of, will be over 1,000 people, if we asked, could we take all that data that's coming in off the wearables, off of questions, active, passive data, could we make a map and ask how variable are those individuals and whether the risks for complications, preeclampsia, preterm birth, when is someone going to deliver, could they be forecast? Could you get a sense? A nice example that came up last week, the woman who's driving the machine learning on this, Anna, mother of 3, was looking at this and she said, you know, we're mapping it to the phases of pregnancy. Where'd those come from? Why don't we redo the whole map? Right? Why are we using someone else's version of it? Another person said, wouldn't it be nice if you could know 1 week beforehand that you were going to deliver? That would be a good thing to know. And so this study that we're doing is beginning to give us insights in the extraordinary difference that are there in various people. And the concept of knowing how can you give that back to that person. So our interest is in asking what could that person do with that data is something we're working on there.
And before I go to Mike, because I want to add one more cool thing, which is we're talking about measurements of the person, with and without wearables. What about stuff that's going on around us in the environment? Is there any way to, does that have any role on our health at all? As we're finally understanding that aerosols might be, are like much more important than we were told for the spread of COVID. And then I'm going to come back to Dina to talk about privacy briefly, because you gave a nice answer, I know, before online that I heard. And then we'll throw it to the audience for questions.
Funny you should ask that. I'll just add one thing. We are doing a lot more with machine learning and smartwatches as well. We can tell, for example, get some signal out of red blood cell count, things that are related to anemia, and even fasting glucose you can get from a smartwatch measurement. They're not clinical grade measurements, but they're enough to see shifts to tip you off. So I think this is going to spread to a very, very wide range of areas. And then an area, this is still very much in the research phase, but we're trying to measure what you're exposed to with airborne exposure. So both biologicals and chemicals. And if you think about it, you're sitting here right now, what exactly are you breathing? Are you breathing good stuff or bad stuff? We mostly worry about bad stuff, but actually nobody's really explored the field of good stuff. Like what kinds of good things out there would actually help you, maybe reduce stress or things like that. But we are doing a ton in this space. So we capture biologicals and we sequence. This has to be done offline. It's not real time yet. It will be, we hope. And we are, I discovered, I always assumed I was allergic to pine, but it turns out I correlate better with eucalyptus. I have a very big pine, a very big eucalyptus tree behind my house. And if one has to go, you can guess what's going to go. It's going to be that eucalyptus. So that's clearly what's tipping off my allergies. But also chemicals. It turns out DEET is everywhere. Certain carcinogens are everywhere. Plastics are everywhere. But their amounts will vary a lot depending exactly where you are. I don't know yet what the Aspen exposure is going to be, but I will know at some point down the road here, probably in 2022. We'll do the analysis. And I hope it doesn't have as much of those nasty things I just said, but we'll find out. And you can actually then act accordingly. You can take measures. And these days, there are ways of trying to strip out chemicals from your house with molecular. And then all of us have a study in the area of Crohn's disease. So we're very, very interested in trying to solve Crohn's disease, which has both environmental exposures and other genetic and other problems as well associated with it. And so in our particular study, we're trying to measure what environmental exposures are teamed up with flare-ups that happens in Crohn's patients. So we're very keen to try and solve that. And then the obvious thing to do is mitigate those exposures so that, folks can avoid flare-ups. And with the wearables on lifestyle and things, you should be able to also adjust that as well. So you can build, to your earlier point, individual machine learning AI models on a person. And we've done that on me to see what your background is, what's a perturbation from your background. And You want to do this in what I would call a time series delay, meaning if something happens here, what's the consequences here a day later? And that's the goal, to be predictive about all this. And that's where we'd all like to take the field, I think.
That's great. And you know, you give me the thought for the very first time. I remember when people started coming in and saying with these huge reports that I got everything in my body measured. I don't know what a normal chromium, like, what am I supposed to do with this? And it was the same thing with genetic analysis and microbiome analysis. And so we're gonna have to figure out how to teach this to the clinicians of the future to say, how do you interpret this? When do you hold? When do you fold? Talk about privacy. Not your privacy, but the privacy, you know, I will say that when I very excitedly told this to some people, they said, oh, it's kind of creepy though, isn't it? You know, because, you know, your data is going up and people can see it, and we think there may be ways of protecting that, but, you know, does it work?
No, I do believe that every cool technology can be used both for good thing and bad thing, and particularly like for something like what we work on. I mean, if somebody can just like through a wall get your physiological signal without even like you seeing them, that of course is something that we have to be very careful about, and we are. So basically, there are two sides to the answer. One is technological. I mean, we develop technology that allows the device to ask the person who's asking for these measurements to check that that person has access to the space that they are saying measure.
That's cool.
That they are the person who get the measurement is the person who's being measured. And then there are policy, of course, that are very important, and also following standard ethical procedures, like of course getting approval, following protocol for everything that one does. But at the end of the day, I think also the most important thing is to start with a strong belief that the patient is who owns the data, and it's the patient who decides who gets access to that data. I know Stephen is working on many things to empower the patients to have access to their data, be the one in control of the data, and be the one who makes the decision about how that data is used. So both to protect the data and also empower the patient with that data.
You want to say something quickly?
Real,
We have 10
real
minutes.
super quick is that people, I think, are waking up to how their personal data is one where if it was anonymized, might be better. What I don't think people realize is when you have data, it allows you to understand behaviors and to forecast and predict. And so I think I'm more concerned of who is able to learn something about people in general and what drives them and how to make them dance. And so I think the zone of privacy needs to be one that's thoughtful about the data, but also realizing that sharing all those behaviors with groups may be something, whether it's companies or countries, we could look back on it and go, was it worth it?
Yeah. And I know you've written and you all believe you're not eliminating people from this. You know, you need the human factor, interpretation, judgment, wisdom, empathy, all the connection. Q&A. Yes, Debbie. Oh, wait, get a microphone.
Hi, my name is Debbie Rubin. I'm a journalist, so I think information is power. So this has been really interesting, and I love all the data that you've been talking about. I have a two-part question. The first has to do with health equity. Who has access to these digital devices, and what is the infrastructure that's going to be necessary to really spread out enough to really gather population data? And then the second part is just a thought that occurred to me. I'd love someone to comment on this. When full body scans were available, people were going in and like all of a sudden all these things were popping up that nobody knew anything about.
Incidentalomas, they're called.
Incidental, whatever. And, you know, then that led to, you know, all this testing that's expensive, that's invasive, et cetera. So is that a danger in gathering all this data?
Who wants to start?
I can go at either of those. With the last one, I'm a believer you can never have enough data. And I think it's a matter of managing it properly. So if you talk to any physician today, they'll tell you don't get a whole body MRI because you'll have nodules, right? Men have them in their prostate, women have them in their ovaries. My retort is that's not the point. The question is, do you have any growing nodules? And the way you know that is you take longitudinal measurements. So if you actually measured people more than once over time, you could see if any of them were growing, and you could use that to your benefit. But if you had an accident now, or say you had cancer now, and they looked for these nodules on whole body MRI, they don't have a baseline on you if you haven't done one before, so they wouldn't know what was there previously. And so I think you do need a healthy baseline, and again, you should. So I think it's a matter of managing it.
Well, but you know what's interesting is he's saying it's not it's not a snapshot. So
Right.
because you're doing it continuously over time, you'll know if it's changing, which is a really important distinction. Who wants to talk about the health equity? Because I think
I'll do the health equity and the other, or at least, and then to.
and then Dean,
I can
The
say
health
something if I
equity
can.
is a serious, real problem, and it needs to be addressed. And I think people are waking up to it instead of like not aware. But any emphasis that you can place on that is needed. The interesting thing off of the type of N1 wearable data, and I would glad to go into this at another time. If you've used cohort data that's been collected on others that doesn't apply to you, and you have a way to go to have a concept of who should get what treatment built off of individuals, this is an enormous power to the individuals that are very less well represented in a population, because by learning of what's the change for them, so there's this flip side to the fact that the wearables give an opportunity to actually look at individuals as individuals and not matching to a set that will be interesting. And then on the...
and so much research has been inequitable, and we know the NIH, Dr. Collins is here, has made big efforts to recruit other groups so that it's more equitable in terms of the data that we're getting.
That's right. And then the other quick thing on this aspect of, we cannot start giving patients information of what's happening to them without having a system where those that are going to receive that information are better prepared. That it isn't going to work. If it was bad for where it has been, the data that's coming off all the wearables and others are really a puzzle to the clinician and what is going to be said. And so I think that an emphasis on training, and I think the NIH and others have been thinking about get clinicians ready. How will we get clinicians ready to be able to interpret that?
And I will say, as we're running out of time, because those questions that Debbie asked were really two big, important questions that I
actually, John,
omitted.
if
I
we
wanted to
things
leave the
about
last thing
equity.
I'm going to leave the last word and go for it.
So I just want to add two things about equity. So actually what we are talking about improves equity along two axes. The first one is we know a lot by now that when people go to a medical professional, there is some judgment about, okay, she's a woman, she's more likely to be exaggerating her pain, or this person comes from this background, they are not realistic about what's happening to them. When you have actual objective data and about all individuals, then you are not, you cannot say, oh, they are exaggerating. No, actually, this is objective data. Their breathing has increased by 6 breaths per minute. Their heartbeat has changed by that. And then it allows us to look at all people in the same way, in an objective way. This is one thing. The other thing is that it improves equity also in terms of access. So, for example, again, in Parkinson's, there are statistics that show that about 40% of patients don't have access to a neurologist. Imagine somebody who has Parkinson's, 40% in the US don't have access to a neurologist because they live away from health centers that are specialized. By being able to bring this measurement to them in their own homes and then take it back to the clinician, to the centers, then actually you expand health equity significantly.
Dina, Stephen, Michael, okay, even I can learn. I got it on the first time. The first time happened to be the third time, but I can learn. I'm not a machine, but I apologize for getting your names mixed up at the beginning. And as you can tell, I'm lit up by this. I think I can't wait to come back again and talk about this a year from now or 2 years or whenever and see where this goes. But I'm telling you, you heard it here last, because you certainly didn't hear it here first. They've been talking about this for years. This is a big deal. And we're at the beginning, and yes, there are things that are going to have to be worked out, and it's a little rocky. There are some ethical issues, there are some science issues, there are some personal issues, but this is not going away, and this is potentially transformative, I think, for medicine. So I think that we all would like to give them applause for a wonderful job.